Today's episode is a chat I had with one of my dear friends, Allison Anderson, whose first book comes out in 2 weeks from today. It's called The Spring Maiden. I've already read a tiny sneak peek, and you can too if you want to. You just have to join our email list. I'll put the link in the show notes. And I am so excited to dive into the rest of this book. I'm just, over the moon excited. I'm Andy Smiley, the Friendly Podcast Guide. I'm a mom who has used podcasts to fight the boredom and loneliness of motherhood, and now I want to help you find a podcast that can do the same thing for you. It can be overwhelming to try and find a podcast you'll enjoy in the thousands of shows that are out there. That's where I come in. My episodes are short, and they answer all of the questions you'll have about the podcast, so you'll know if it's a good fit for you or not. I'm here to help you find a podcast you'll love without wasting your time. Now, let's talk podcasts. During our conversation, Alli and I cover some of her favorite writing/book podcasts that help her as a writer and entertain her as an avid reader. Before we hear about those podcasts, we're going to take a quick break to talk about my free podcast consultations. I've been able to talk to some amazing podcasters about their shows while doing interviews for the Friendly Podcast Guide. And along the way, I've learned so many tips and tricks on how to start a podcast from the hosts I've interviewed and from personal experience. I've talked to the podcast hosts about what made their launch successful and what made it more difficult. And I for sure know what I would do differently if I could go back and launch my show again. And I want to share my knowledge with you. That's why I'm offering free podcast consults, and I have a couple of spots open in the next month. If you need help nailing down your podcast idea, figuring out your niche, or have any other podcast questions, I would love to work with you to make your show's launch the best it can be. If you're interested in working with me, fill out the intake form in the show notes. I can't wait to answer any and all of your podcast questions. Okay, here's my chat with Alli as she talks about some of her favorite literary podcasts. Y'all, I am so excited. Today we get to talk to one of my very good friends who is also about to become a published author for the first time. And I've already read a little snippet of the book and it is so good. I'm so excited. We get to talk to Allison Anderson today, but I call her Alli because she's my friend. But if you look her up online, type in Allison Anderson, you will find her. Before we dive into her podcast recommendations for today, Alli, will you introduce yourself a little bit to my listeners?
Oh, yeah. I am a wife, a mom. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a very avid book reader.
Okay. Well, I love it. Well, I'm excited to hear your podcast recommendations.
They were good. There were some really, really good ones, especially like when I was starting out as like trying to figure out my author thing and trying to figure out where I wanted to go and what I was doing. Like I didn't know anything. And I kind of started out a little bit later than a lot of authors. And so I needed as much help as I could get. And I was kind of like feasting on all of the author knowledge. And so I tried a bunch of podcasts. There were some that I did listen to a lot, and they really did help me in the beginning figure out what I wanted as an author and what was going to work for me specifically.
Totally. Okay. I'm excited to dive in. What is your first podcast recommendation for us today?
Okay, so the first one I always recommend is Your Mom Writes Books,
which that's a great title.
Isn't that a great title? First of all, great title. It is, the hosts are Charlie and Holmberg, who writes some amazing speculative fiction. Like she does kind of like the gaslight historical fiction, but it always has magic in it. It's really fun. She just came out with her first troll romance, and it's pretty good.
That sounds adorable.
And then Caitlin McFarland is the other host, and she also writes, she has a Dragon Shifter series. They're both amazing and I love them. But I really like their podcast because they kind of talk about everything. They talk about like the publishing industry, like what to expect. I really appreciated it when I like was querying. So when you query, it's when you're trying to get an agent to sell your book to publishers. And they had this whole podcast episode just on querying, and they talked about what to expect, like where different resources for querying, like what you needed to look for, watch out for, and like the faux pas. Because there's, especially in publishing, there's a lot of like secret etiquette that you don't know and you have to know but you have to get it taught to you. And so that was one of the podcasts that taught me that. And so that was something that really, really helped me starting out, and it was really good. And it's funny.
Awesome. Okay. That's a really great recommendation. Okay. What is your second podcast recommendation?
My second one is Between the Lines. The hosts are Sarah M. Eden, Tracy Hunter Abramson, Sean Ann Bessie, and Esther Hatch. All four of them are Regency romance authors.
Okay.
Oh, no, that's not true. Tracy is romance, and she does like mystery thrillers. And I know Sean and Tracy really, really well. I'm friends with them. But it's like a hoot. It's these little friends. They get together and they just talk about books, and they like have cute little guests on. They had my other friend, Amanda Taylor, on there recently, and they just like, you just feel like you're just hanging out with your friends because they're just goofy and silly. And they just talk about everything. And it's really nice for readers and writers. They don't kind of like limit it just to writing stuff. They'll talk about books. They'll talk about like, oh, what are some fun books to read with your family this summer, and like stuff like that. And so it's a little bit wider of an audience, which is kind of nice. But you still get like, you feel like you're in on a secret a little bit because they like tell you stuff about the industry that normal people don't know.
Sure.
But then you're also like, they're like making jokes about them texting each other, and they have like texting Tuesdays. And it's just like so silly, and you just like, oh, these are my friends, you know. And they're just some of the sweetest women that I know, and their podcast is super, super fun.
That is delightful. And truly, as a stay-at-home mom, sometimes I just need a podcast that is just conversational, right? Like I can turn it on when I haven't talked to another adult all day and I am doing the dishes and just like need to stay sane. So that sounds like a really good fit, especially if you love books. Well, maybe only if, well, I guess maybe if you don't like books, you might still like it.
Also, like if you want to learn stuff about how books are made, or like a lot of like the backstage stuff, because there's so much stuff that like even I didn't know in the very beginning that I've learned in the last couple of years that I was like, I would have never guessed that that's something that authors have to deal with, or that publishers have to deal with, or whatever. And so they kind of give you like a sneak peek into the back stages of it. And so it's just fun if you want to know more about like authors' lives and like what's going on because authors are basically just a picture at the back of a book.
That's true.
You know? And so if you want to know what authors are doing, some of these podcasts are really, really good to get to know an author and what their life is like.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that wants to know more about the author, right? Like you read their book, you're like, I love this book. Now I want to know who the creator was, right? I want to get to know them a little bit more. So I love that thought of using a podcast to, learn more about your favorite authors. That's absolutely lovely. And I don't think I've ever thought about that. So now I have more podcasts to listen to, which is never a bad thing.
And like, seriously, like authors love fan interactions. Like that's something that people don't ever think about, is like authors just make the books, right? And the books come to the fans and that's it. But authors, like we are fans of our fans. Like it's such a tight knit community, and like we pour our souls into these books, right? And so when you read them and you love them, you're loving a part of our soul. And so we just appreciate that so much more. So any kind of like fan interaction stuff, we eat it up like crazy. And so when you are eating up our stuff, we are eating up your stuff too.
I love that. Well, and truly, I feel like a smidge that's like podcasting, just in the sense that like I just sit in a room and talk at a microphone. Like when I get to hear back from people that like it's helping, or like they're enjoying what I'm putting out there, it's so heartwarming to be like, oh, hi, you know who I am. Even like I'm always talking at you. It's fun to like get it back. So yeah, I absolutely love that.
Very similar.
Okay, what is your last podcast recommendation for us?
Okay. My third favorite podcast. It's not technically a writing podcast. I just love it. And it is writers. It's big authors. It's Intentionally Blank.
Okay.
Which again, all of these titles I also love, because writers are just,
well, they are writers, right?
They're writers, right? Like they know what they're doing. You know how many book titles they have to figure out. But it is Brandon Sanderson and Dan Wells. And basically what they did is they started this podcast because Brandon Sanderson was just sitting in a room signing books, thousands and thousands of books for all of these, the Kickstarters and all these things that he has coming out. And he's like, well, we're just sitting here talking. Why don't we just record it? And so they did.
There you go.
And it's actually a really, really fun podcast. And they always start the podcast with a story of a heist.
Okay.
And so like they've shared what's like the big maple sap heist that happened in, I think it was either Canada or northern US.
Sure. A snowy place.
These people stole like thousands and thousands of gallons of maple syrup.
Okay.
And like made tons of money. There was one, there was an alligator farm that they stole all these alligator eggs. And there was one, these elephants were stealing sugarcane out of the back of farmers' trucks.
Oh my God.
Like all of these little heist stories. They always start the podcast with a heist. And so it's like a really fun, like segue into it. And then they'll talk about movies that they've watched. They'll talk about like anything, but it's writers. And so it's like, they still talk about writer things.
Sure.
But it's not like a craft podcast or like a book podcast. It's just them being goofy and just having a conversation while Brandon Sanderson just sits there and just like writes
thousands of books,
signs over and over and over again. Yeah. But it's super fun.
That is super fun.
It's really funny and really dorky and fun. So if you just want to listen to two people have a dorky conversation about heists or about why they didn't like certain movies or why they did like certain movies or like anything and everything in between, it's a fun dorky podcast with nerds. It's a nerdy podcast because they're nerds.
I love that. Well, and truly, Brandon Sanderson definitely has a following. So if you, listener, like Brandon Sanderson, then this sounds like a great podcast for you. And I will make sure to link all of this in the show notes so that you can go directly to whatever podcast fits your fancy. And Alli, I can't let you go until you tell me a little bit more about your book and when it's coming out and all of that stuff so that my listeners can also pre-order, because I have already pre-ordered, but they haven't yet because they don't know about you yet and they need to.
So my book is called The Spring Maiden. It is the first of 4 books in the Cartographer's War series. It comes out October 3rd of this year, and I am so excited. It's available for pre-order pretty much everywhere. Yeah, and if you pre-order, you can submit your receipt for some swag on my website, which is AllisonAndersonAuthor.com.
Perfect. I'll put that in the show notes too, so that people can go there after they pre-order. Perfect. That is so awesome. And I am so glad that I got you on the podcast to talk about at least 3 podcasts. So we'll take it. And
I just don't listen to podcasts.
Sure. Well, you're busy writing right now. You've got other things going. Well, you've got kids and yeah.
All of the things.
They're just other things. And that's totally fine. I feel like you read way more books than I do. And I listen to way more podcasts than you do. So here we are.
It's a good balance.
It is. We balance each other out. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. And I cannot wait to read all of The Spring Maiden. It's going to be absolutely wonderful.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. All of those podcast names were pure gold. If I ever start another podcast, I'm definitely running all of my name ideas past several different writers. Let me know on Instagram when you try out any of these podcasts so we can talk about them. And don't forget, if you have the itch to start a podcast but need some help, fill out the form in the show notes so I can answer all of your podcast questions during a free podcast consultation. Talk to you soon.
Oh, they do bad story ideas too. That was the other one. They don't just do food heists. They do bad story ideas.
So it's either a heist or a bad story idea?
A heist or a bad story idea.